Today I will share 3 deaths and/or murder cases connected to voodoo. But before we get into it, if you enjoy my narration of various mysterious and strange stories, then I would appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel. With that being said, let's get into it. El Padrino. For the very first story, I have to give a trigger warning. I am honestly not sure if YouTube will tolerate this video, so I will have to be a little subtle when describing some of the gory details. Either way, in the early months of 1989, a series of missing person cases occurred around the Mexican-American border. The hotspot for all these cases seemed to be Matamoros in Mexico. But one specific case was so disturbing that news of it reached far into the United States, shocking people across 2 countries. Near the Texan border, but still located in Mexico, there is a popular region called South Padre Island. One day, a young student named Mark Kilroy, along with his 2 friends Bill Hattleston and Bradley Moore, decided to visit this region. South Padre Island was a popular destination for people studying in Texas and who were looking for an opportunity to party. What Mark couldn't have known at the time was that he was indeed driving towards his last party. After crossing the border, they decided to make a stop in the city of Matamoros. Again, Matamoros being a popular party spot. So far, their vacation went exactly as planned. They got drunk, enjoyed the sun, and chilled at the various pools. On the evening of March 11th, they entered a local bar. Since the bar was seriously lacking in the sanitary department, Mark decided to go outside to take a leak at some tree. The only problem was that Mark Kilroy never returned. He left the bar and just vanished from the face of the earth. Since Kilroy was part of a rich and prestigious family, the Mexican authorities did anything in their power to solve this mystery. But in the beginning of their investigation, there was basically no evidence. Their best clue was the statement of some drunk guy who claimed that he had seen Kilroy the night he vanished. According to this man, Kilroy had been talking to a Mexican with a big scar on his face. Since this was just a small lead, the police focused on putting up missing persons posters, and the family offered $15,000 for any clues in connection to his disappearance. Even the popular series America Most Wanted covered this case. Unbeknownst to the public, many more people continued to vanish in the area. The Mexican authorities knowingly kept this a secret to avoid further criticism. Ironically, a completely unrelated investigation led to this case getting solved. When the Mexican police organized a sting operation targeting the local drug scene, they searched the property of a man named Elio Hernandez Riviera. As expected, they found 25 pounds of weed on his property. The important part is that Elio's house was just one of many small houses located on the property of a large ranch. When they arrested Elio, the owner of the ranch obviously wanted to know what was going on. The police quickly explained the situation and were about to leave the area. But then, one of the officers remembered to show the owner a picture of the missing Mark Kilroy. At this point, the Mexican authorities made it mandatory for any officer to show this picture to anyone involved in a crime scene, even if the crime seemingly had nothing to do with the disappearance in Matamoros. As you can imagine, the officers were quite surprised when the man informed them that Mark Kilroy had indeed been on his ranch. To be precise, he had seen Kilroy in another one of the houses on the property, one of the smaller and more remote ones. Since they were already at the scene and Mark Kilroy was a high-priority case, the officers got into their vehicle and the ranch owner showed them the way to this house. Upon arriving at the scene, they realized that the house was locked. But they didn't even need to open the door to understand what they would find inside. The stench of blood and decaying bodies was palpable every time they took a breath. Before entering the house, they called for reinforcement from Cameron County Police Department in Texas. After all, the officers of both countries cooperated to solve the Mark Kilroy case. When they finally opened the door, they came face to face with a horror even they didn't imagine. One of the officers later stated that during his 22-year-long career, he had never witnessed such a disturbing scene. The house was literally filled with body parts. The wall was painted with blood, and in the middle of the room there was a large iron cauldron. Inside this cauldron there was a disgusting soup composed of human hearts, various body parts, and the horns of a goat. Additionally, the cauldron was surrounded by various utensils commonly used in voodoo rituals and other dark magic. When they were done searching the place, investigators found at least 14 corpses. Some were ripped apart to such an extent that it wasn't easy to determine if they were part of an already discovered body or if they were what was left of a completely new victim. Among the bodies found were also the remains of Mark Kilroy. Investigators later learned what had happened to the young man. And this is where I once again refer to the trigger warning, because Kilroy's death might be the most sadistic I have ever heard of. The night he went missing, he was kidnapped and brought to this shack. There he was subjected to various forms of torture and brutally sodomized, which means that he was forced to have intercourse with different animals, with Mark, of course, being the passive part. Finally, they laid him down on the floor, and while he was still alive, they opened his skulls with an axe and extracted his brain. Additionally, his corpse was missing his legs, and his spine had been hung up with a wire. But who was responsible for these cruel acts? Well, after arresting and interrogating every single person on the ranch, investigators were able to close in on the perpetrator. The whole thing had been orchestrated by a Cuban-American man named Adolfo Constanzo, also called El Padrino. His partner in crime was Sara Aldrete, who was known as the Witch in the local drug scene. And together, they had built a small drug empire. Adolfo was raised by his mother's second husband and was lectured in everything related to drugs and occult rituals. Through this man, Alfonso studied different religions such as Palo Alto, Palo Mahombe, and finally Voodoo. He was actually regarded as a high priest when it came to voodoo rituals. Alfonso, Sarah, and all his followers were convinced that blood rituals would make them invincible. And this was the reason for the murders he committed, because Alfonso was convinced that being protected by a blood ritual did not only mean that he was literally immortal, but that, in a more metaphorical sense, he was protected from any and all danger. In his madness, he thought that by sacrificing all these humans, his occult gods would protect him from both the police and rival drug organizations. In a sense, this prophecy even came through, because even some brutal drug lords were afraid of this monster. They had heard the rumors about his occult rituals and the dark magic he was supposedly able to wield. However, Alfonso could not be found. Only some of his gang members were caught rather quickly. And once again, the police were saved by pure luck. When officers were called over a case of domestic violence, they happened to drive to the exact house Alfonso was hiding in. Alfonso mistakenly thought that they were there for him and began to shoot at the officers. There are different versions of how this situation was resolved, but it's either that Alfonso was killed by the police, or that one of his followers killed him following Alfonso's request. Either way, Alfonso Constanzo died that day. 14 people were caught, and 12 of them were sentenced to 30 years in prison, while the remaining 2 were never punished. For her involvement, Sarah was sentenced to 60 years in prison. During these trials, it was also revealed what happened to Mark Kilroy, in case you might have wondered how we know the exact circumstances of his death. In the end, another friendly voodoo priest was called to the property and blessed this haunted spot. The shack was shredded and the remains were buried. The police didn't want this place to become a possible meeting spot for other occult groups. Cholera curse. For our next case, we reverse the roles and talk about a case where peaceful voodoo priests became victims of a brutal crime. A perfect example that most people practicing voodoo are just peaceful priests and not brutal monsters like Alfonso Constanzo. In 2010, a large cholera outbreak hit the country of Haiti. Several thousand people died, 120,000 were treated for symptoms of cholera, and more than 60,000 people were hospitalized. This would already be bad enough, but what followed this disastrous outbreak was a terrible blame game leading to the murder of 45 innocent people. Back then, and even today, there are still priests performing voodoo rituals, or at least including voodoo rituals in their religious worships. However, in contrast to our first case, these priests only perform healing rituals and never show any violence. Despite that fact, some of the less educated citizens of a village, plagued by the disease, decided that it was those priests who had conjured up the recent cholera outbreak. What followed were brutal lynchings in several regions throughout Haiti. In one region, 40 priests were murdered in just a few hours, and 5 more priests were murdered across different communities. The victims were dragged out of their houses and publicly stoned or hacked with machetes. Finally, their bodies were burned, believing that this would cleanse their curse. A highly prominent voodoo leader, Max Beauvoir, later blamed the government and said that police were not doing enough to stop the violence, especially since this whole blame game began in early 2010. Back then, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake hit the country, devastating their capital and killing more than 250,000 people. According to Max Beauvoir, this earthquake marked the beginning of this witch hunt. He said, "Since the earthquake, some people have been blaming us, saying that we cast spells and did evil things which brought the earthquake as a punishment." The Ripper Crew. This series of mysterious murder cases began with the discovery of several heavily mutilated women. The first victim was found in 1981 in Illinois by a young couple walking their dog. The 28-year-old Linda Sutton had been attacked with knives and blunt objects for several hours. Forensic evidence showed that while the woman was still alive, the murderer had cut off one of her breasts. Even though the police didn't know it at that time, this murder marked the beginning of a series of brutal ritual killings. 1 year later, they found the body of Lorraine Borowski in a cemetery. At this point, she had been missing for more than 5 months, and when she was found, they discovered that she had been mutilated in the same way as Linda Sutton. Shortly after, they found the remains of another missing woman named Shui Mack, and once again her body had been heavily mutilated and was missing one breast. Police were quick to understand that all the victims were connected and that the locations they had been found were not where they had been killed. Despite having no clues, those 2 facts made it obvious that a serial killer was on the loose. Some time later, a woman named Angel York was found drifting in the Chicago River, once again missing one of her breasts. But this time, the woman was still alive. Apparently, her kidnappers had believed that they had killed her and dumped her body into the river. This was the first time the police received a rough description of the killers. Either way, the following months, many more women fell victim to his unknown serial killer. Only when the police found Rose Davis and Beverly Washington were they able to gain some crucial information. Just like Angel York, these two women had survived the attack despite suffering the mutilations we have come to know. The information provided by them led investigators to the home of Robin Gecht. Upon entering his home, they found a large voodoo shrine, more akin to a small chapel, as well as human remains. The man was arrested, and 3 more possible accomplices were identified: Edward Spritzer and the 2 brothers, Andrew and Thomas Cocoralis. When subjected to an interrogation, Thomas Cocoralis folded rather quickly and cooperated with the investigators. What followed was a testimony filled with an obsession with dark magic, a deep hatred for women, and a series of brutal ritualistic murders. The 4 men had been friends for a long time and regularly met in the home of Robin Gecht. Over time, this group dynamic evolved from a normal friendship to a cult. You see, while most of these men would be considered unintelligent, if not completely stupid, Robin Gecht was considered intelligent and charismatic, a classic power dynamic in cult-like relationships. At this point, Gecht had practiced occult satanic rituals and dark voodoo rituals for years. In his home, he had constructed the aforementioned chapel, dedicated to his occult beliefs. He elevated himself to the position of a voodoo priest and lectured the other men. You could say that they were his disciples. This group would later be known as the Ripper Crew. Besides their obsession with dark magic, all these men shared a distinct hatred for women and sadistic tendencies. According to Thomas, this hatred was rooted in several rejections and humiliating moments they had experienced thanks to women. This is actually the reason why the other 3 got into voodoo in the first place, because Gecht claimed that he could use dark rituals to force women to like them. So they were basically a group of creepy, violent incels holding weekly voodoo rituals. At this point, this could be considered to be a sad existence, but unfortunately, with their growing anger, their rituals became more and more gruesome. Which brings us to Thomas's account of what they did to the kidnapped women. Apparently, Gecht would go out and approach women. Officially, he was chosen for the job because he claimed to possess magic abilities to force women to obey him. In reality, Gecht was the group leader, as well as the most handsome and charismatic one of the group. It is actually assumed that Gecht didn't suffer from any problems approaching women. But when he realized that this was an easy way to manipulate his friends, he monetized on this discovery to lure them into his cult. This is a classic method cult leaders use all the time. Either way, if one of these unfortunate women agreed to go with him, Gecht would bring her back to his chapel. There, the 4 men would have their way with the woman for days, before torturing and murdering them in the aforementioned way. But this isn't where their depravity ended. They would eat their victim's breast and other body parts as part of some voodoo ritual. Other parts were stored in containers in the chapel as offerings to evil spirits. In the end, they murdered 18 women that way. Everyone except Gecht confessed to the crimes and told investigators that they shouldn't underestimate Gecht. According to them, Gecht was able to put a spell on other people, forcing them into obedience. He supposedly acquired these powers through their voodoo rituals and promised them that they would gain the same powers if they continued on this dark path. Gecht denied all of this, but considering all the details provided by the others, this case was closed. Gecht was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Thomas Kokoralis and Spritzer were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And Andrew Kokoralis was sentenced to death. You might be wondering why he deserved the death sentence, while the cult leader was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Like I already explained, Gecht did this whole thing to recruit his friends to his voodoo cult. But he was not the main offender when it came to the assault and the murders. Of course, he took part in those activities, but according to the testimonies of the two surviving victims, Andrew Kokoralis had been the most brutal one by a long shot. He was described as a brutal, sadistic monster who seemed to gain joy from torturing his victims. But since this video is about voodoo cases, let's go back to powers Gecht supposedly possessed, because all the surviving victims actually corroborated the story that Gecht had put a spell on them. All of them claimed that within minutes of talking to Gecht, they had no way of refusing any of his commands. They knew they were suffering, but for some reason, they couldn't force themselves to think about escaping. Since these are rather weird statements coming from actual victims, different theories were suggested to explain this phenomenon. Some forensic experts assume that Gecht might have been a master manipulator, a so-called mentalist. There are people on this earth that for some reason have an almost magic way of manipulating people, and if you watch some of their shows, you are really perplexed by their talent. It is assumed that these mentalists use a mixture of charisma, verbal suggestion, social pressure, visual cues, and mental framing to influence perceptions and reactions. This lets them guide participants towards the responses, outcomes, or choices they want. For instance, a mentalist may hint that choosing a certain number will lead to something positive. On the other hand, people who are more open to the supernatural think that he actually possessed the ability to wield dark magic. Actual voodoo priests from Haiti and West Africa confirmed that the rituals used by Gecht were legit and followed ancient voodoo teachings. Furthermore, these teachings claim that these exact rituals could be used to control another person and bend them to your will. So Gecht at least didn't come up with some make-believe spells, but followed real rituals. Of course, the fact that these rituals are old doesn't mean that they work, or that voodoo is real. The police obviously didn't care for explanations like this and viewed them as ordinary serial killings. But I am interested to hear your opinion on this interesting topic. Do you think voodoo is legit? And is it possible for a man to teach himself these rituals to such an extent that he can use dark magic? Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.